So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's Msdn webcast. This is Beginning Website Development. Today we're doing part one of this two-part series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's Msdn presenter. We have Anand Iyer here with us, and Anand is part of the Developer Evangelist team here with Microsoft. So Anand, I'm going to hand it on over to you and let you get started.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, and I hope you're all doing well. Just a quick couple of housekeeping things. What I'll be doing at the end of the webcast today is making all of the demo code and the slides that I'll be using today. I'll be making it available on my blog, and I noticed that I actually forgot to include my blog URL here in my slides. So I'm actually going to make it available to the question and answer pane. I've already done that. Now, for those of you who are just joining us, if you have, again, as was mentioned earlier, if you have any questions that come up during the course of the webcast, please feel free to keep them coming. I'll actually address them towards the end of the session since I'll be kind of flying solo today. This is the first of a two-part series on how to develop and create websites. Now, I know a lot of times we tend to do a lot of in-depth webcasts and very focused things, but I decided to take a step back and kind of introduce you to how you get started if you were to create a website using some of our tools today. And I wanted to abstract out a lot of the details. I just wanted to give you a very introductory session on how to create websites using Microsoft's tools. A lot of these things that you'll see here today are free. They're very budget friendly, as I like to put it. So please feel free to download these tools like Visual Web Developer Express and start playing with it because they're free and they're available to you today on MSDN. And I'll also make some of this information available to you as we go along. So here's what we'll be looking at today. I tend to do a lot of 200 and 300 level webcasts. I'd like to rate this webcast at a very 100 to a 200 level. Now, this particular module is really targeted at those who are relatively new to web development, but you have a basic understanding of HTML and you've used web interfaces in some way, shape, or form in the past. Now, if you don't have any programming experience, don't worry at all because I won't be really doing very much coding, but in those instances where I will call your attention to it and you'll see how easy it is to integrate some programming experience along with very simple HTML experience. The goal of this module really is to acquaint beginner web developers with the fundamentals of building dynamic websites using ASP.NET. Just keep in mind though that it's not really feasible to become a very productive ASP.NET developer with just one or two modules of content. And what I really want to do is I wanted to open your eyes to the potential for dynamic content when you're building websites. Now, even if you have a little bit of ASP.NET web development experience, I'm hoping that your interest will be piqued to explore this platform further once we're done with this particular webcast and the second webcast that I'll be doing exactly a week from now, which is slightly more detail-oriented, but it talks about how you can deal with the data in websites. As I mentioned before, the tools that I'll be using here today are all free, and they're all available on MSDN for you to download. And if you have any questions on where you can get these tools, please feel free to get in touch with me using the question and answer pane or send me an email using my blog. So here's the agenda today. The four major topics for this module are kind of outlined here on this slide. Including the basics of creating web applications with our tool, the Visual Web Developer Express Edition, the fundamentals of working with ASP.NET 2.0 and server-side controls, how to debug web applications inside of Visual Web Developer Express, and finally, how you deploy a completed website by copying files to a live server. The goal of this slide here is to show the interaction between a client that's using a web browser and the web server responding with the actual content, and to motivate what will be involved when you're building a website that's on a server. Now here's what really happens when the user of a web browser, the user that's using a web browser types an address into the address bar and hits enter. A request is issued to the server that's identified in the address bar, and that server, which is sitting somewhere across the internet, has got the files, the images, and other data that's stored on its disks, which it sends back in response to the browser request. This response from a web server is typically formatted as HTML, which the browser then renders as the typical web pages people are used to seeing every day. So this is commonplace. These are things that you're probably used to seeing today. But I thought this would give us a nice little premise so that we can now go further and see how you can actually build these websites that will reside on these servers. The environment that you'll be using to create dynamic websites with ASP.NET is called Visual Web Developer Express. Now, this particular tool will set up the initial set of files that are needed to create a website. It's important for you as website designers or developers to really choose the development language when you first create the site, so that it will create the associated code behind and class files in the language that you choose. Keep in mind that the language you choose has really no impact on what you're able to accomplish. It is really a matter of preference. Most often, developers choose a language based on what their colleagues are using to simplify the sharing of code and resources. Now, what I'll be using here today is going to be C# because that's the language that I'm most comfortable with. But if you're a VB.NET developer, or if you haven't ever developed before, you'll notice that that is really not a prerequisite for you to create websites using ASP.NET. In fact, one of the nice things about ASP.NET is that you can actually mix and match languages as well. So you can have one particular page that has a C# code behind and another one that has a VB.NET code behind, and that's completely acceptable as well. But we'll get into the details when we do some demonstrations in a little bit. When you first create a website with Visual Web Developer Express, you're actually going to be presented with a default.aspx page in the source view. Now, if you're used to using design tools in the past, you may feel a little uncomfortable here. So if you see the top part of the screen here, the first graphic, this is what you'll initially get to see. But if you're used to using a designer tool, don't worry about it, because just by clicking on the design tab, you can just as easily switch over into the design-oriented view. The design view gives you a true WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get kind of experience, and should be intuitive for many of you to start with. For those of you that are already comfortable with editing HTML by hand, there is something available called IntelliSense. If you look at the first graphic here that I'm highlighting right now, you'll notice that as I start to type things out in Visual Web Developer Express, it'll give me a drop-down list of options for me to complete what I think I'm going to type. And we'll see this in action just a little bit when I switch over and start doing some demos. This particular feature is called IntelliSense. All right? Now, what we've done is we've reviewed what the initial site creation wizard generates for you, which is going to be the default.aspx, the default.aspx.c# or .vb, and the app data folder. Now, this is what you'll get when you just go ahead and do a file new website using Visual Web Developer Express. The next step will be actually adding additional pages to this website. And that's really what the slide is demonstrating here. The three most common items that you will probably use are going to be ASPX pages, for one, HTML or HTML pages, two, and style sheets. If you're familiar with HTML and CSS or cascading style sheets, what you'll notice is that it is possible to use Visual Web Developer Express to build a static site that's comprised of simply HTML and CSS files. But you have to realize that the real strength of using Visual Web Developer Express is how you can build dynamic websites using ASP.NET Pages. Dynamic websites like Amazon or Microsoft.com or Msdn, these are sites that render content based on specific user inputs. It's not necessarily just a bunch of static text that's residing on the server, but it's actually content that's being rendered back to you as the end user based on some input that you would have given to it. Now, you'll notice in the graphic on the right here, and it's maybe a little hard to see, it's kind of a tiny graphic, but this is the Solution Explorer. The Solution Explorer window shows the physical directory structure for the site, and any changes like adding a folder are just simple changes to the file system of your operating system itself. It's just as simple as adding files or directories directly through the Explorer, and those will be reflected directly in your Solution Explorer. So I've spoken to you quite a bit about what you can do, and I've given you kind of a high-level overview. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to switch over into Visual Web Developer Express, and I'd like to give you kind of a first-hand view of how you can use this tool to create websites. So what I have here is I have Visual Studio opened up, and again, you're more than welcome to go off to Msdn and download our free offering of Visual Studio called Visual Web Developer Express. Very popular tool, very easy to use out of the box, and the best part above it all, it's free. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new website, and I'm going to create a very simple ASP.NET website. You'll notice that quite a few templates come up here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to plop this website into my local file system, and I'm simply going to call this guy Demo Web. What you'll notice here is that in my location dropdown, I have a few different places where I can actually plop this particular website. Now, for the sake of this demo, for starters, I'm actually going to create this website on my local file system. So it's going to be extremely trivial, very rudimentary, and I'm not even going to deal with the intricacies of involving a web server like IIS at this point in time, because I'm simply dabbling around and trying to get a feel for how I can create a very simple website. I also have the option of dropping this website into an HTTP location or an FTP location, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. The second drop-down that I want to call your attention to is a language that I'm going to be choosing to create my website. I can use VB.NET, I can use C# or J#. For the sake of this demo, I'm going to be going with C#, but you'll notice that I'm really not going to be writing very much code at all. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and you'll notice that in just a few moments, a few different files are going to be created for me here, one of them being the default.aspx page, and you'll notice that in a few moments it's going to show up, and it's actually going to come up by default in a source view. Associated with the default.aspx page in our Solution Explorer, you'll notice that there's a C# file that's kind of the code behind, the C# code behind the actual ASP.NET markup. And you'll notice another item here in our Solution Explorer called the app data folder. We'll actually investigate the app data folder and what you can use it for in a lot of detail in my next webcast, which is the second part of this two-part series. Now, what you'll notice here is that if some of you are out there more familiar with some of the other design tools, if you're not comfortable in working with markup right from the get-go, let me go ahead and minimize this properties window here. If you're not comfortable in working with the design view right from the rather the source view, simply clicking on the design tab here on the bottom part of the page will switch me over into the design look and feel. So if I'm not ready to work with the markup just yet, I can start to work with the design field. So in here I can say something like, this is my home page. I can highlight this, and I can use my formatting toolbar here to make this an H1. So increase the font size and make this a heading on my particular page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit enter right after this guy, and if I switch back over into my source view now, what you'll notice is that everything I've done up to this point in design view has been synchronized over into my source view. So the reality of it is, every time I make a change in my design view, it's the markup that gets updated, and it's simply using the markup to represent it appropriately in the design view. You'll notice that the design view and the source view are always going to be in sync. In fact, if I were to leave my cursor here, right between the M and the E in home, and I switch over into design view, you'll notice my cursor is still there in design view. So there's a really beautiful way for us to stay in sync between the design and source views. Anyhow, what I'd done was I hit enter after I typed in this is my home page, and I'm going to do some very simple things. I'm going to say home, page 1, and page 2. I'm going to select the word home, and I'm going to create a hyperlink out of it. So I'm going to click on this little button here that's going to convert this particular piece of text into a hyperlink. I'm going to click on it, and now it's going to say what link would you like me to point this particular piece of text to. I'm going to click on browse, and I'm going to select the default.aspx page, which happens to be this particular page you're working on right now, and I'm going to hit OK. You'll notice now that my home piece of text here, the text called home, has now become an actual hyperlink. I can go ahead and create links for these two pages as well, but before I do that, I'm actually going to create these two new pages. So I'm going to hit Control S as in save to save this particular page. I could have also clicked on this button here to save this page. I'm going to go over to my Solution Explorer. I'm going to select my demo folder, right click on it, and I'm going to add a new item. And this new item is going to be a web page or a web form, just like page1.aspx. I'm going to go ahead and select, I'm going to replace default.aspx, rather default2.aspx, and give it a name like page1. You'll notice here that I have the choice of going with another language for this page. It doesn't, not all the pages have to be in the same language, which is a very beautiful aspect, which is a very beautiful feature of ASP.NET. I'm going to go ahead and place the code in a separate file for page 1 as well, and I'm going to hit add. I'm going to create another page, and I'm going to say add new item, just like I did before. This time around, I'm going to call it page 2. And I'm going to hit add again. So you'll notice now I have 3 pages. I have a default page, page 1, and page 2. All are valid pages in my solution. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch back over into my default ASPX page. You'll notice they all show up as tabs here in Visual Studio. I can select page 1, and I'm going to create a hyperlink for page 1. And as you've probably already guessed, I'm simply going to point it to page1.aspx. Hit OK, and the same deal for page 2 as well. All right, so what you'll notice now is that I've created some very simple links on my page. I've got some text in here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag and drop a very simple HTML control that you may already be familiar with called the horizontal rule. I want to call your attention to the toolbox that's here on the left side, or rather it's kind of docked here along the left side of my Visual Web Developer Express window. And you'll notice there's quite a few compartments here. So for example, if I wanted to drag and drop a very simple HTML control like the horizontal rule, I can simply click on this guy, drag it, and drop it directly into my web page. And it'll have created an HR, or a horizontal rule element for me. Switching over to source view, you'll notice there is my horizontal rule. Okay. Now, for example, if I'm someone who's comfortable with working with HTML and I want to do this by hand, I can simply do this right here, and I can hit Control S to save. If I switch back over to design view, you'll notice now there are 2 horizontal rules that show up. Okay. Let me go ahead and delete this guy. One of the other things you'll notice is that, and as you'll notice this today, as I'm doing this webcast, you'll notice this in my next webcast, I've got a little bit of an OCD. I like all the elements in my page here to be kind of neatly lined up and formatted, and it annoys me when they're not lined up well right from the get-go. I can configure this ahead of time to make sure that that Visual Web Developer Express is following my formatting rules. But just to show you, I can just as easily select all of this and say format this selection, and it formats it in a very nice and clean manner. Okay, so that's another option available to you, and I can hit Control S to save. Switching back over to design view, this is where we left off. Now, just for the sake of this demo, I'm going to add some text in here. I'm going to say some text goes here in my home page, blah blah, and I'm simply going to Control C to copy this, and I'm going to paste it quite a few times to make it appear like there's quite a bit of text that I've typed into my page. Now what I'm going to do is, and I've already done this so that we can differentiate this page from the other 2 pages that we have, I'm going to switch over into source view. I'm going to copy this particular, all of this that you see over here. I'm going to hit Control C to copy it, switch over to page 1, and I'm going to paste it right here inside of this particular div element. And again, I've noticed all my formatting is off, so I'm simply going to right click and format the selection. And instead of saying this is my home page, I'm going to say this is page 1. And I'm hit Control S to save this page, switch over to design view, and this is how page 1 looks now. I'm going to do the exact same thing for page 2. Let's go in here and do a Control V for paste. Let's format the selection, and there you go. And this time around, we'll say this is page 2. Okay? So some very, very simple things here to get us started. Now, what I want to do is actually want to run this, because what you've seen so far is you've seen the actual page getting rendered inside of Visual Web Developer Express. But what would this website look like if it were rendered inside a real browser like IE or Firefox? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the debug. I'm going to click on debug here, and I'm going to say simply start without debugging. What this is going to do is it's going to launch an instance of Internet Explorer, and it's going to actually render the website inside of Internet Explorer. What you'll also notice is that a balloon popped up in the bottom right corner of my screen here that says the ASP.NET Development Server is running this website for us. Now what we've done to make it convenient for a lot of you out there so that you don't have to start working with IIS right from the get-go, what we've done is we've included a mini web development server into Visual Studio and Visual Web Developer Express. And this web server is going to render the pages for us. You'll notice that this simple web server is actually running on port 55469 on my local host. You can also determine that from the address bar up here. And I can now start to navigate through my pages, and it'll behave just as if it were running on a live web server. I can click on page 1, and that's what page 1 looks like. And I can click on page 2, and it looks extremely simple. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this URL. I'm going to do Control-C, and I'm going to launch this particular website in Firefox. All I want to do is I want to demonstrate that Firefox is a browser that's very popular. It's very common out there today. And when you build a website, you want to be sure that the content that you're building is actually browser agnostic, that it runs on any browser without you having to do very much work. So that's one of the things that I want to demonstrate here is that with ASP.NET, you're not tied down to using just Internet Explorer. Your end users are not tied down to using just Internet Explorer. They can use the browser of their choice. Okay? So they can navigate through links just like you could with IE as well. All right, so having said that, I'm actually going to dive back in and walk you through a few more slides. I notice there's a few questions in queue here. Please keep them coming. I'll actually take questions towards the end of the session today. Now, what you probably saw in the last demo, after the last demo, you should be comfortable with the concept of creating static content in a website. Now, what you'll see is that this slide is kind of a transition between, or rather from static to dynamic, and it provides a point for us to discuss the reasons you might consider creating web pages that render their content dynamically. And examples of such sites are Amazon, eBay, Microsoft.com, and you have to wonder how much of the content there is actually static and how much of it is actually dynamic. And it'll be pretty obvious to you once you log into that site or you actually were to visit these sites. And this is where the true power of ASP.NET comes in. It lets you build web pages that contain a mix of static as well as dynamic content. The core mechanism for generating dynamic content in ASP.NET pages is the server-side control architecture. And it's really key for you to understand this before we proceed so that you can understand how dynamic content can be created using ASP.NET. Now, in the previous demo, you'll have noticed that there was some static content, whatever it is that we'd added onto there. I added some static content. I said blah, blah, blah. Now, what we can do is we can actually wrap that entire static text into something like a label control, which is an ASP.NET control. An ASP.NET server control is typically prefixed with an ASP colon. So you'll notice here in the first sub-bullet, even in source view, when we switch back in a little bit, typical ASP.NET controls are prefixed with ASP colon. That's how we identify that these are server-side controls that do some work on the server side before rendering the content back in vanilla HTML back to the browser, because that's what the browser understands. The beauty of using ASP.NET server-side controls is that they can be modified programmatically. So if there's something that you want to do on the server side to generate and render static content, you can write the code for it, or you can handle it using ASP.NET. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss where and how to modify the content of these server-side controls. Now, before we discuss how to modify this control content, we have to introduce the method in which the control's content will typically be modified. So you see here an event and a piece of code called the page load. Now, the page load is called by the page after requests for the page has come in. And this is the ideal place for you to make changes to dynamic content. And I'll actually demonstrate this to you in a little bit once I switch back into demo mode. So there's actually a sequence of events that happen so that, rather there's a sequence of events that happen so you can figure out where you want to plug in your code for generating dynamic content. The event sequence goes something like this. There's something called a pre-init, there's something called an init, there's an init complete, there's a preload, there's a load, which is what you're looking at right now, there's a load complete, there's a pre-render, there's a render, and then there's an unload. And these are the events. This is the sequence in which these events get triggered. Each of these events that I just spoke to you about can be handled by authoring a method that's named page underscore the event itself. Like, for example, page underscore pre-init. You can actually handle the event. You can actually add some code in there to do something before the request even gets initialized, for example. And that's a lot more detail, but I'll be more than happy to discuss that with you later on. But to keep this at a fairly simple and rudimentary level, it's very important for you to understand that even if you want to generate dynamic content, the page load event is a very important event that you need to consider handling. Now, what you'll notice is that there's an implicit wire mechanism that's built into the ASP.NET parser, and it'll look for a method with this particular name, like page underscore load, and it'll automatically subscribe it to the event exposed in the page class with the exact same name. So finally, let's change the content of a page programmatically. There's a few important things that I want to get across before we move on. Each server-side control can be accessed via the ID attribute of the control in your code. For example, you'll notice here, what I'm going to highlight here in just a little bit, you'll notice there's an ASP:label ASP.NET control, and it has an ID associated with it. This ID is what we're going to use to identify this particular ASP:label control. Okay? Now, controls have collections of properties that can be modified to change their content or their appearance. I haven't really modified the property of this particular label here, but for example, I could say that this particular text box needs to have a background color of black. Okay, these are all properties that we can modify, and I will walk you through some of these things when I switch back into the demo a little bit. You can add logic into your page load handler to dynamically change the content of the controls. Now, the example that you see here is a little silly, but what you're seeing here is that this is without having to connect to an external data source. I'm able to generate some very dynamic content. Also keep in mind that in my next session, my next webcast that I'll be doing a week from today, that's on the 12th of April, I'll be talking to you a little bit more about how you can hook into data source controls and actual data repositories like a SQL Server database and extract data from there and display that dynamically. Now, in this particular slide, what I'm doing is I'm kind of pulling together the few things that we've spoken about in the last 3 slides into just one simple slide. You'll notice that this page is being kind of done and it's represented here in its entirety. And you can, in fact, if you want right now, you can simply go to File, Print to PDF. You can print this entire slide deck out to a PDF file. You can copy everything that you see here, paste it into a .aspx, and launch it using ASP.NET and Visual Web Developer Express. And this is actually a complete ASP.NET web page that you see over here. Also keep in mind that I'll make the source code that I'm working with right now, I'll make this available to you on my website as well. So this is the entire site. Let me walk you through this real quick. The page directive here right at the top indicates that this page is going to have some C# code inside of it. Now let's skip the script tag here. Let's skip all of the script bit here. But you'll notice as we move in, there's some very simple HTML controls. There's a title for this page. As we move down, you'll notice that there's an ASP.NET control here called the label control that's called Sonnet label. By default, this label is going to say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? However, when the page loads up, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the current date and time, and it's going to say, if the hour right now is less than 12, then I'm going to print this particular text here. If it's greater than or equal to 12, I'm going to print this piece of text down here. Okay? So some extremely trivial things here, but hopefully you get a feel for how to work with dynamic content. Now, with this slide, I wanted to introduce some of the core set of server-side controls that are available and what they render to the client. Keep in mind that the purpose of these controls is to provide server-side access to modifying the content or the appearance of the elements on the page. Now, I want you to contrast this with static HTML, which you need to modify by hand. If you wanted to get a feel for what all these controls are, they're available to you in the toolbox in your Visual Web Developer Express. So having said that, let's actually dive in and do another set of demos now so you can kind of put together everything we've seen thus far. I'm actually going to switch back over into my Visual Studio environment. And where we left off last was we created a very simple page, a few set of pages, the default ASPX page, page 1 and page 2, and we ran them in both IE and Firefox. What I want to do here is I want to use a server-side label control to dynamically change the content of my home page based on the time of day. The goal of this demo is to show a very simple dynamic control to convey to you the concept of dynamic content in a page. So let's go over into my page1.aspx, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag and drop a standard ASP.NET control called label control. I'm going to plop it right in there. I'm going to hit, there's two ways I can access the properties for this label control. I can right click and go to this list of properties. Alternately, as I've kept my control selected, I can also hit F4 to bring up the list of properties. What you notice is that by default, the label comes up and says the text inside of this label is going to be called label, which is really not very cool. It's actually kind of silly. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to say something like, welcome to this webcast. And if I hit Control F to save now, you'll notice that is the default text for my particular page. But what you'll notice is that through the course of this demonstration, you'll never actually get to see this particular piece of text rendered, and you'll see why in just a little bit. Because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to override. I'm going to write some code into my page load event that's going to override this piece of text with something I'm going to be providing using some C# code. And I can get to this code by simply double-clicking anywhere on my design surface. So as I'm here in my design surface, I'm simply going to double-click my left mouse button, and that's going to take me to the code behind this file. So if I switch into my Solution Explorer now, you'll notice page1.aspx.c# has been highlighted. So in my page load event, I'm going to do something very simple. I'm going to say if date time dot, and you'll notice this is where IntelliSense kicks in. It helps me complete what I want to type, and also gives me the list of possible options, so I don't really go wrong. I have this list of options to choose from as I start to type things in. So datetime.now.hour is less than 12. I can say label 1, which is a label I just dragged and dropped into page1.aspx, which is this guy right here. I'm going to say label 1's text property is going to be equal to good morning. However, if the date, if the hour is greater than or equal to 12, I'm going to say label1.text is equal to good evening. I know this is a very silly demo, but hopefully you get a feel for how you can modify the contents of a particular ASP.NET server-side control. I'm going to hit Control F to save. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit Control F5, which I can alternately do by clicking on the debug menu option here and say start without debugging. And what this is going to do is it's going to bring up page1.aspx for me. Let me go ahead and refresh this page. And you'll notice it's going to say good evening because I'm in California and the time here currently is 12:34 p.m. And if you remember from the code that we typed in, if the hour is greater than or equal to 12, we're going to print good evening. Let's test this out real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the time on my machine. Okay, so I'm going to click here on my clock, and you'll notice if you're still using XP or prior versions of Windows, or if you're using prior versions of Windows, this interface is a little different for me to change the date and time. So let me go ahead and change the time, and user access control is going to kick in. I want to change the time to, let's say, 9 a.m. and hit OK. OK again. You'll notice the clock has now changed. If you were to look at the bottom right corner. Now, if I refresh page1.aspx, I want you to observe what happens to this text here that says good evening right now. It switches and says good morning. Okay? So that was an example of how you can render content based on some attributes like the time, for example. Okay? Before I forget, I'm going to switch the time back. Otherwise, I'm going to probably forget about some appointments that I have later today. It's currently 12:35 p.m. All right. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to switch back in and walk you through a few more things using my slides before I dive back in and do some demos. All right. Now, we've looked at some of the server-side controls, and we've presented how to modify the content and appearance of these server-side controls programmatically. But you're probably wondering how we might respond to something like user interaction. For example, if someone were to click on a button, click on a link, use a drop-down box, or use a list box, use a checkbox. How do we react to events like these? Now, how you'll deal with these are by using something called server-side events. These are events that fire in response to the user posting the page back to the server, which is issuing another request to the same page. The button control should be easy for most of you out there to relate to. Now let's take the button control as the example. If you were to click on the button, this is typically what would happen. The user would click on the button. This would generate another request to the same page on the server. A method that you write in the page is going to be invoked. That's the second step, which is going to give you the opportunity to modify the content of these server-side controls. And third, the modified page with the new content is going to be represented back to the user. So hopefully that is clear. You can achieve the same type of interaction with other controls like a hyperlink or a link button as we call it in ASP.NET speak, a drop-down list, a list, or a checkbox. And each of these can be configured to generate a postback by setting their auto postback property to true. And we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a little bit. Now the second piece of this picture of the server-side events is the actual handler itself. And in this slide, I wanted to show you how the click event of a button control is being wired up to a method called a myButton_click that you see right over here. What you'll notice is that in the ASP button control, there's actually a new property that's been added called the onClick. And it says that the onClick, whenever this button gets clicked, we should invoke, or rather we should call a piece of code called myButton_click. So the control is then redirected to this piece of code over here that then does something like sets the text property for a label to something new. Keep in mind that this is, and I'm showing you the source view for all of this. Keep in mind that this can just as easily be done using design view. You don't have to do this in source view. In fact, I'll be doing this in design view as well. Now, there's a few things here about the code behind, and I haven't really touched this in too much detail just yet, but very briefly, what you'll notice in this slide here is that right at the top, I'd say that this particular page is going to be coded in C#. It has a code behind file associated with it called codebehindsample.aspx.c#. And that is where all my C# code is going to reside. There's in some of the previous slides, you'll notice that I had the option of inlining some of this code. The code can get embedded directly into my ASPX page using the script tag. I prefer to go with the code behind route because I think it's extremely clean, extensible, and modular, but it's completely up to you as to how you want to deal with it, okay? So, but once you start using it, you'll start to, it'll be very intuitive and it'll come to you very naturally. But as you start working with it, I recommend to you that you start working with code behind more so than code inline. So let's dive in now and let's do some more demos. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're actually going to be looking at some events and how we can deal with the code behind files. And we'll actually respond to some user interaction. So I'm going to dive back in now. And let's go back into Visual Studio, Visual Web Developer Express, and start modifying the same website that we had been dealing with up to this point. Now this demonstration is going to walk you through how to add a button to a form and how you can implement a server-side handler for its click event. What we're going to do is, let's start with that. Actually, we won't deal with the code behind or the code inline too much. I'm only going to be dealing with the code behind for this particular site. We'll start with that, and time permitting, I'll show you how to do it inline as well. I'm going to go ahead and open up page2.aspx, and right after, let's do all of this in design view. Right over here, I'm going to drag and drop, or rather, let me just start typing. I'll say, enter your name, and I'm going to drag and drop a text box right after this piece of text over here. And what I'm going to do next is right below this text box, I'm going to drag and drop a simple ASP.NET button, and below the button, I'm going to drag and drop a label. Now here's the behavior that we want this page to have. Once the user gets to this page, we want them to type in some piece of text over here. We want them to click on the button, and once they click on the button, we want the label to be refreshed with whatever was entered in this text box over here. Very, very simple and rudimentary behavior. And you're probably thinking, wait, this is extremely simple. And you'll notice how even simpler it is to actually put this together using ASP.NET and Visual Web Developer Express. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the default behavior for this label control. So I'm going to right-click and bring up its properties, and I'm going to say, let's go ahead and remove the default text from label and just let's leave it blank. I'm going to hit Control-S to save this. I'm also going to change the text property for the button. Calling a button isn't really isn't a very nice user experience. I'm going to change to something like push me. And what you'll notice as soon as I switch focus from the properties pane back over to the design view is that the text value actually changes to push me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add the event handler for the button, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on the button here, and what that's going to do is it's going to say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire up a click event for this button, and you're welcome to type in any code that you want to do here. Basically, what is the experience that you want your user to have? What I want here is I want label 1, the ID for this label is called label 1. I want label1.text to be something, okay? So I'm going to say label1.text is equal to, I want you to excuse me for just a moment. I apologize, I had to sneeze there, and you didn't want to hear that over the phone. All right, so I'm going to say label1.text is going to be equal to hello, followed by whatever it is that we extract from the text box. So I'm going to say whatever is in text box 1.text, and I'm going to say thank you for visiting this site. Okay, it's extremely simple. Let's walk through that again. When someone clicks on the button 1_click event gets fired, and we're going to say that inside the click event, we're going to say label1.text, which is this guy, is going to say hello, followed by whatever it is that we extract from text box 1. Thank you for visiting this site. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So that's all the change that I want to make. I'm going to hit Control S to save, and I'm going to hit Control F5 to run page2.aspx. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. And I'm simply going to type in here my name. And if I hit push me, you'll notice that the label now gets refreshed with this new information. Okay? It's extremely simple for you to set up. Let's quickly give this a whirl using Firefox as well. So I'm going to hit Control C to copy the URL and paste it in here. And exactly the same thing. And you'll notice the behavior is exactly the same as before. All right, so hopefully you got a feel for how you can add code behind and how you can start wiring up events associated with certain ASP.NET controls that may reside on your page. Let's go back and let's look at a few more slides. Whoops, that's not the slide deck that I wanted to use. Here we go. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about is how you can debug using Visual Web Developer Express. I've introduced enough programming techniques now, and every now and then you may run into certain issues, and you may want to diagnose these problems as they come up. What I want to do is I want to introduce the concept of the debugger that's built into Visual Web Developer Express. Now, as with a lot of you out there who are programmers, you may already be familiar with some of these concepts. But for those of you who are not developers today, what we can do with the debugging tools in Visual Web Developer Express is that we can set what's known as a breakpoint in your code. What that means is, as we're starting to work through several lines of code, if you were to hit a particular point in this particular C# file or VB.NET file, Visual Web Developer Express will then pause going any further, and it'll actually say, all right, I'm going to break here, and I'm going to show you what you can do with this site. Here's where we're going to stop, and here are all the different pieces of information that this page is going to work with as it starts to render the content. So to set a breakpoint is going to be very trivial. I'm going to show you how to do that. You can simply look at the leftmost column here in excuse me, in an ASPX page, and simply click along the line there, and that's going to set a red button, as you can see over here. And to start the page, up to this point, we've done Control F5 to start the page without debugging. To start it with debugging, we simply click on F5. That brings up the site in debug mode. So that's kind of the difference between Control F5 and F5. And basically where you would use debugging is if a page is not kind of behaving the way you expect, the best thing that you should do is actually set a breakpoint and then kind of step through each line of code line by line until you kind of figure out what the problem is. These are some of the key things that you will do while debugging, all right? Now, what you'll notice is that hovering over with the mouse cursor over variables shows the current values of these variables. How the line of execution is actually indicated by the yellow arrow, and the locals window shows all local variables with their current values, and most importantly, the step over button will help you move to the next line. And I'm actually going to demonstrate this to you right now. Switch back over into Visual Studio here. And what I'm going to do for the sake of this demo, I'm going to show you how you can use the debugger that's built into Visual Web Developer 2005, the Express Edition. And I want you to get acquainted with some of the basics of using the debugger to diagnose issues. So let's go back into the example that we were looking at a few moments ago, where I'd set label1.txt to be something based on user input that we received. So you'll notice here that this may be a little hard to tell from live meeting, but there's actually a little gray area here, and I'm using my air quotes as I say gray area, but right along where the line numbers are, I can actually click right over here, and that drops a maroon circle right where I want to stop and observe things. Okay, that's where my breakpoint is going to live. To start up the site with debugging, I'm actually going to I can hit F5, or I can simply click on debug and say start debugging. As soon as I do this, it's going to come up with a prompt that says, to enable debugging, we need to add a new file to our solution called the web.config file. Okay, and I absolutely want that in there because I want to debug this page, and I'm going to refresh this page so I can start debugging it. Now, you'll notice right away that we hit the breakpoint, and I haven't really shown you much right now. So I'm going to hit F5 to ignore this. Let's go back and pretend that we're debugging right now. Let's type in something new in here. Say something new. And as I hit push me, I want you to observe what happens. You'll notice that Visual Studio starts blinking here down here in the list of open windows, and it's trying to call my attention saying that we've hit a breakpoint, or I need you to look at something. So if I switch focus into Visual Studio, you'll notice that the yellow arrow is telling me that we've hit a breakpoint. You'll notice the locals window down here, the locals pane down here, helps me look at all the local variables in this scope. So I can look at what the event args contain, what the sender has actually sent over to me, etc., etc. One of the other really nice things that I really like about the debugging tools in Visual Studio and VWDE is how I can simply hover over a variable. So as I hover over a variable, you'll notice this little area comes up right below it, and I can get more details right then and there. So a little window shows up, and it gives me all the details about that variable. So I can hover over label1.txt, and as you can imagine, label1.txt contains the text string that we had set in there previously in the previous post. It says hello with my name, and it says thank you for visiting this site. However, if you were to hover over text box 1 and we look at this guy's text property, you'll notice it says something new. Some of the other really nice things I like about this particular visualizer is how I can click on this little magnifying glass and I can look at it in an XML view, and I have a little schema issue there, so we can ignore that. But we can also look at it in HTML view. So that's how that would look in HTML. So there's a few different ways to visualize it, but these are some really, really powerful debugging tools to help you diagnose issues and consequently fix them. Now, what you'll notice is that if I were to switch back over into IE, you'll notice that the green progress bar down here says that the page is stalled. It's not moving because we're not receiving anything back from the web server. If you were to also observe the IE7 tab up here, the spinny continues to spin because it hasn't really received anything back from the server. It's still waiting. And the reason being that we're currently stopped. We're waiting for a response to come back from the web server. What I'd like to do is I'd like to step over this line and continue with the current control flow. To do that, I can simply hit F10, or I can click on this button here that says step over. So if I step over it, you'll notice that the yellow cursor now points to the closed curly bracket. I can step over this guy as well, and guess what? We're done now. We're done debugging, and the page should have actually rendered hello something new. The spinny is no longer there. The green progress bar is gone. We've just debugged this particular guy. Okay, so that was a very basic introduction to how you can debug your site. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about deployment. So let's switch back over, and I want to show you a slide on deployment. Now, this is kind of the last topic of this particular module, and what you will notice is that until now, all of the pages we have built have been run through Visual Web Developer Express using the built-in ASP.NET Development Server. This utility is for testing purposes only and cannot be used to host pages on a server for external clients. It is physically limited to local requests only. It's absolutely phenomenal. This tool is phenomenal for testing and development, but when you want to make your site live, you need to deploy the site to a server that's running IIS. What you'll likely do is select an internet service provider to deploy your site to, which is really kind of the point behind this slide. Once you have a server to deploy to, all you need to do is deploy your site by using something like FTP or whatever mechanism that your host supports. There's also a copy website utility that's available in the website menu in Visual Web Developer Express that does an intelligent copy to a remote location using either FTP or HTTP or front page extensions. And will only copy the files that have changed and can also be used to synchronize files between the two locations if any changes have been made to those files on the server directly. There are various hosters available for deploying ASP.NET sites out there today, and many hosters also provide a SQL database to create truly dynamic sites so that people can be aware of what they need when they look for in a hoster. Finally, kind of a brief introduction to how to set up IIS so that you know what must be set up on the server for an ASP.NET site to be hosted. If you're setting up your own server, you will need to install IIS, which is going to be IIS 6 on Windows Server 2003 today. And then you can create an IIS application pointing to a physical directory on your server containing the files that you built using Visual Web Developer Express. So let me show you how you can actually do this, how you can actually deploy your sites to an actual IIS server, and it's actually very, very, very trivial to do. Now, what I'm using here is I'm running Vista, so some things may sound a little or may look a little different if you're running XP or prior versions of Windows. But what I want to show you is how you can deploy a website that's built using Visual Web Developer 2005 the Express Edition to a local IIS application. The first step will be to create the application IIS, and the next step will be copying the files by hand to the application directory. And finally, I'll show you how to use the copy website utility to deploy the files to an IIS application directory. If you don't have IIS installed, some of this you may not be able to follow along directly, but you're more than welcome to ping me offline if you need some help there. So I have my website running here, and you'll notice that Visual Studio is actually telling me that this website is still running. I'm going to hit Shift F5 to stop debugging the site because that is where I previously left it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Windows Explorer here. I'm going to double click on my computer, and I'm going to browse over into my C demos directory and create a deploy directory there. So I'm going to switch over to C demos, and you'll notice there's already a deploy site in here. What I want to do is I'm going to create a new folder here called Demo Web, and this is going to be the physical location where my ASP.NET pages are going to be hosted and where my IIS application is going to point to. I'm going to bring up my Start menu option here, and using the search feature, I'm simply going to type in IIS so that I can bring up my IIS manager. So I'm going to click on this particular link here, which is my IIS manager. It helps me configure and create and configure IIS or websites. And inside of here, I'm going to expand this particular tab here, expand my list of websites, expand my default website, and I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to add a new application, and I'm going to call this guy my Demo Web. The physical path for this guy is going to be the directory that I just created, which is C, Demos, Deploy, and Demo Web. And I'm going to hit OK. And that is really all there is to it at this point. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go over into Visual Web Developer Express, and I'm going to copy these files over using the copy website utility that's available in Visual Studio. So I'm simply going to go over here into my website, and I'm going to say copy website, and I'm going to select all these files here. First, before I select all my files, let me go ahead and connect to my local file system. So I'm going to say connect. And I have the option here of going to a remote site, but for the sake of this demo, I'm working everything off of my local file system. So the directory where I want to plop these files into is C demos deploy demo web. And I'm going to hit open. Now I'm connected to that particular site in this particular case. I'm going to select all my files here by hitting Control A, and I'm going to click on the arrow so that it copies it over into my target location. So now that I've done this, I can simply, up to this point, you'll have noticed that I keep working off of a particular port, like 55469. But I don't have to do that anymore because I've now created a live IIS application that does exactly the same thing. So I can get rid of this here, my port number, and let's go over into localhost/demo web. And what this should do, by default, it'll bring up my default.aspx page, and you'll notice that I can navigate through it just like I did in the past. I can type in something here and click on the button, and it'll behave exactly like it did in the past. I can even test this using Firefox. So if I were to go over into localhost/demo web, it behaves just like it did in the previous example, except that it's not running in 55469. In fact, to show you there's no smoke and mirrors, let me go ahead and stop this web server altogether. And you'll notice that things continue to work just fine because I'm working with IIS right now. Okay? All right, so let me switch back over and quickly wind down. And let me do this. But I want you to stay tuned because there's a few more very important things that I want to cover with you. So please don't leave just yet. Let me sum up, and then I'm going to turn it back over in fact, I'm going to turn it back over to Janet, who's going to walk us through a few more things before we wind down here. But to sum up real quick, hopefully you got a feel for how you can create sites using Visual Web Developer Express, what ASP.NET server-side controls are, and how you can modify their content dynamically, and how you can respond to events and deal with them from within your website. And hopefully you also got a feel for how you can use the debugger in Visual Studio and how you can deploy websites very easy to IIS. So having said that, I'm now going to turn it over to Janet, who's going to walk us through some very important things. So please don't leave us just yet. And while she's walking through some of the things here, I'm going to look at some of the questions that you have for us in the queue.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Anand. And I'm just going to remind everybody, if you have questions, right now is the time to get them into the queue. Just hit that Ask button in that lower right-hand corner, and Anand's going to get to your questions in just a moment here. If you haven't done so already and you'd like to, you can print a PDF of these slides. Just go into that File menu in your upper navigation bar, and you'll be able to do a print PDF. So nice to have all of these resources that were on these slides as well. So we do record these webcasts, and if you'd like to see any of our previously recorded webcasts, as well as anything that's coming up, everything is posted right there at microsoft.com/webcast. If you have content ideas, anything you want to see us do differently, we love hearing from our audience. And there is yet another URL there where you can contact us. And then lastly, I'd like to let you know that today's webcast was presented using the Microsoft Office Live Meeting technology. There is a free 14-day trial, and all you have to do is go to microsoft.com/presentlive to be able to get that. Now, as always, we have a survey coming up here. I want to point out that for filling out our survey, you're going to be automatically entered into a drawing to win this great little Zoom digital media player. So it's a little bit of an incentive, but really your feedback is very valuable to us. So if you could just take a moment, fill out that survey before you log out, we do appreciate that. And you should all be seeing that survey now in your slide area. So if you take a moment, hit that little registered online area, and that'll take you right into our survey. And with that, Anand, any questions you want to go through?
I'm actually going to take all the questions through the question manager. In fact, there's one of them that I haven't had a chance to get through just yet, but there's one question that I want to address over the phone, and that's Bill Walter's question. Bill's question is, when should someone consider starting a site that's generated with Microsoft Expression Web or Microsoft SharePoint rather than starting with a Visual Studio project? That's a really, really good question. Now, keep in mind that the Expression Web product is geared for those who are mostly designers and not so much developers. Now, everything that I've done here today, absolutely any site that you create using Visual Web Developer Express can be opened in Microsoft Expression and vice versa. So think about it this way. Let's say you've created a nice little website, but you want to spruce it up with some nice design, things that you cannot necessarily do with Visual Studio today because it's very focused on creating dynamic content for websites. That's when you would use Microsoft Expression. Now, as far as Microsoft SharePoint goes, that's a completely different, actually, it's not a completely different beast. It's a different beast. But what I would say is, if you want to design a website, if you want to create a very simple website that's got fairly static content with some amount of code behind, start with Microsoft Expression. If there's a lot more code behind, then I would patch that gap by using Visual Web Developer Express. So Bill, I hope that answers your question. If you have any more, please feel free to ping me again. In fact, there's one other question here that I want to answer. Conrad's question is, can 1.1 and 2.0 run side by side? Are there any settings or changes that need to be made? So, Conrad, the answer is yes. Both 1.1 and 2.0 ASP.NET sites can be run side by side. When you go ahead and you try to deploy a site, please make sure you actually set the particular site's ASP.NET version to the appropriate version number, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Okay. Rob's got a question here, and the question is, for a public site, how would membership in Visual Studio 2005 help me? So Rob, that's a really good question. You're talking about the membership provider and the membership controls in Visual Studio and ASP.NET 2.0. Now, the membership provider is a very extensible model. So there are things that you can use out of the box that are fairly rudimentary that may not apply or may not be appealing to a public-facing website, but the provider model is so extensible that you can actually configure it to point to a completely different set of credentials that are stored elsewhere, or so on and so forth. So it's extremely configurable. So that's how I would start looking at the membership provider, and that's how I would go there. There's also another webcast. I can probably give you a lot more information on how you can deal with those, or rather how you can deal with the providers. So if you'd like, you're welcome to ping me offline. I can give you a pointer to that particular webcast. So, Jana, looks like there's a few more questions here in the queue, and I'm actually going to take them offline. I'm actually going to be responding to them one-on-one through the question manager pane here.
Excellent.
So we can actually wind the session down.
Okay, well, no problem. So if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to still put them in there, and Anand will answer them via that Q&A text window there, so you can look for your answers to your questions down there in that below in that pane. So with that being said, just going to remind everybody once again, your feedback is very valuable, so please do take a moment, fill out that survey before you log out. We do appreciate that. We do pass along your comments to our presenters as well, so Anand appreciates that information and feedback as well. And with that, I'm just going to extend a special thanks to Anand for today's presentation. So thank you so much, Anand. And we hope to see everybody back for part 2. That's next week. And that concludes today's MSDN Live meeting. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And our